When your children don't respect you, do this instead. 6 powerful ways to regain respect. See, there comes a moment in life, a quiet, unexpected moment, when you realize the roles have shifted. The children you once held in your arms, guided through life's challenges and sacrificed so much for, now look at you differently. Maybe they dismiss your advice, ignore your calls, or speak to you in a tone that stings. It's subtle at first, a glance, a sigh, a shrug, but then it becomes clearer. They don't respect you the way they once did. You might feel hurt, angry even. After all, haven't you given them everything? Haven't you earned their respect through decades of love and sacrifice? But here's the painful truth. Reminding them won't change it. Arguing won't fix it. Begging will only push them further away. Instead, there's a different path, one that is far more powerful than confrontation. A shift in how you carry yourself, how you respond, and how you reclaim your place, not as someone desperate for respect, but as someone who commands it effortlessly. Today I'll share 6 transformational strategies to regain your children's respect without fighting, guilt, or resentment. Some of these may surprise you, but if you stay until the end, you'll discover how to restore your dignity, rebuild respect, and create a relationship where you are valued, not out of obligation, but out of admiration. Now, let's begin. 1. Shift from needing their approval to gaining their admiration. In ancient China, Confucius once said, "Respect yourself, and others will respect you." These words, though spoken thousands of years ago, hold a truth that transcends time, culture, and generations. Yet in today's world, many parents find themselves unknowingly chasing their children's approval, mistaking love for validation and respect for agreement. But true respect is never granted to those who seek it. It is given to those who inspire it. I remember an old friend, Albert, a man of deep wisdom, with hands that had built homes, hearts that had carried burdens, and eyes that had witnessed the changing tides of time. He had been a carpenter, a man who carved life from wood, shaping both beams and the souls around him. Albert had 3 children, each successful in their own right, yet as the years went on, he found himself in a strange place, a house filled with voices, but an absence of being heard. His words, once sought after, were now dismissed with polite indifference. His advice, once respected, was now tolerated. At first Albert didn't understand. He had done everything a father should do. He had worked tirelessly to provide, taught them the importance of honesty and hard work, and sacrificed his own dreams so they could chase theirs. But now, he felt like a relic, admired but not valued. He began bending over backward to gain their attention. He offered help even when it wasn't needed, downplayed his own desires to accommodate their busy lives, and softened his convictions to avoid confrontation. He mistook compliance for closeness, and the more he tried, the less they seemed to care. One evening, as Albert sat alone on his porch, he found himself remembering a story his grandfather used to tell him when he was a boy, the story of Diogenes and Alexander the Great. Diogenes was a philosopher known for his disregard of social status and material wealth. He lived in a simple barrel and had no interest in the world's approval. One day, Alexander the Great, the most powerful man of his time, visited Diogenes and offered to grant him anything he wished. Diogenes, unimpressed by power, simply replied, "Yes, move out of my sunlight." Alexander, instead of feeling insulted, was struck by the philosopher's independence. He turned to his men and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." Albert thought about this for a long time. Diogenes had no army, no wealth, and yet he commanded respect, not by demanding it, but by being someone who did not need it. That night, Albert made a quiet decision. He would stop chasing his children's approval. He would stop shrinking himself to fit into their lives. Instead, he would live as the man he had always been. And so, the changes began, not with grand gestures, but with small shifts in how he carried himself. When his children spoke down to him, he no longer laughed it off. He simply let the silence fill the space, a reminder that he did not owe them agreement. When they dismissed his opinions, he did not argue. He simply stated his thoughts with quiet certainty and moved on. He started reading again, picking up the books that had gathered dust over the years. He found joy in working with his hands, crafting wooden furniture, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He reconnected with old friends, shared laughter over coffee, and stopped waiting by the phone for calls that never came. At first his children hardly noticed, but slowly something shifted. They started asking for his advice again, not because he pushed it on them but because they saw that he carried himself with wisdom. They stopped assuming he would always be available because he was no longer waiting on them. He became someone they had to make an effort for, and in that effort, respect was rekindled. One Sunday his youngest son Peter came to visit. As they sat in the backyard, Peter watched his father run his hands over the smooth finish of a chair he had just built. There was a quiet strength in Albert, one that Peter had not noticed in years. "You know, Dad," Peter said, "I think I used to take you for granted." Albert chuckled, not with bitterness but with understanding. "We all do that sometimes," he replied. "The important thing is that we realize it before it's too late." Peter nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't see his father as just an aging man but as someone worth listening to. Albert never had to ask for respect. He simply became someone his children couldn't help but respect. And that's the lesson, isn't it? When you stop needing validation, when you carry yourself with quiet dignity, the world takes notice. Respect is not about being agreeable, accommodating, or waiting for others to see your worth. It is about standing firm in who you are, continuing to grow, and never shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. Now I will turn this over to you. Have you ever found yourself chasing your children's approval? Have you ever felt the shift, the moment you realized they saw you differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom, your experiences, they matter, and if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's remind each other that respect is not given, it is earned through the way we live. 2. Stop fighting for their respect, embody it instead. The great Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." These words carry a lesson that many parents forget as they grow older. Respect is never won through debate or by reminding others of your worth. It is alive, it is embodied, and it is seen in how you carry yourself, not in how loudly you speak. I once knew a man named Thomas, a retired professor, with a sharp mind and a heart full of stories. For years he had commanded respect in the classroom, his students hanging on to his every word. But in his own home, something had changed. His grown children no longer asked for his advice. His opinions, once met with deep conversation, were now brushed aside with polite smiles or, worse, indifference. At first he pushed back. He tried to remind them who he was, the man who had guided them through life, who had been their pillar of wisdom. When they dismissed his thoughts, he argued. When they ignored his guidance, he repeated himself, hoping they would finally understand. But the harder he fought for their respect, the more distant they became. One evening, after another frustrating dinner where his voice had been drowned out by his children's casual chatter, Thomas sat alone on his porch. The night was still, except for the rustling leaves in the autumn wind. He thought back to a story his own father had once told him, a story about a man named Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States. Coolidge was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He never demanded attention, never raised his voice. His quiet confidence commanded respect, not by force, but by presence. Thomas reflected on this. Perhaps the problem wasn't that his children no longer respected him. Perhaps it was that he had been chasing their respect instead of owning it. The next morning Thomas made a silent vow to himself. He would stop arguing. He would stop proving. Instead he would become the kind of man who needed no explanation, no defense, only quiet certainty. The changes were subtle at first. He stopped inserting himself into conversations that did not need him. Instead of arguing his point, he simply stated it once, then let silence do the rest. When his children dismissed his words, he no longer fought back. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet, unwavering presence. He continued reading, thinking, and expanding his mind, not for them, but for himself. At first, his children hardly noticed. But then, something changed. They began to ask him questions again, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. When he spoke, they listened, because they could feel the weight of his words. He no longer demanded respect. He commanded it by the way he carried himself. One afternoon, his daughter Emily came to him with a decision she had been struggling with. She sat across from him, her eyes searching for the wisdom she had once taken for granted. "Dad," she said quietly, "what do you think I should do?" Thomas took a slow breath, feeling the depth of the moment. He realized then that respect had never left him. It had only been waiting for him to reclaim it. So he answered her, not with urgency, not with the need to prove himself, but with the quiet certainty of a man who did not chase respect, but simply embodied it. And that's the lesson, isn't it? Respect isn't about proving your worth to others. It's about being so certain in who you are that others recognize your value without you having to say a word. Now I turn this to you. Have you ever found yourself fighting for respect, only to feel like it was slipping further away? Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped chasing it, it started coming back to you naturally? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom, your experiences, they matter, and if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's remind each other that true respect is not won through words, but through presence. Redefine your role. Move from parent to mentor. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates once said, "I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think." These words hold a deep truth, especially for parents whose children have grown into adults. Too many mothers and fathers try to teach their children the way they always have, by correcting, advising, and even warning. But the truth is, grown children do not want teachers, they want mentors. And the moment a parent learns to step back and guide instead of control, everything changes. I once knew a man named Samuel, a retired doctor, a father of 3, and a man who had spent his life making decisions, not just for himself but for others. His hands had once saved lives, his mind had once held the answers that people depended on, but now his children were grown, with lives of their own, and suddenly his authority didn't seem to carry the same weight. At first he resisted this change. He still felt responsible for them. He corrected their parenting choices, questioned their financial decisions, and warned them about mistakes before they even made them. He thought he was helping, but the more he tried to guide them, the more they pulled away. His eldest son David stopped calling as often. His daughter Rachel brushed off his advice with polite nods, but never seemed to truly listen. Even his youngest, Mark, who had always been close to him, had begun to say things like, "Dad, I'm not a kid anymore." One evening, as Samuel sat alone in his study, he thought about a lesson his own father had once taught him. He remembered how, as a young man, he had been eager to prove himself. His father, a quiet and patient man, never forced advice on him. Instead, he had listened, asked questions, and let Samuel figure things out for himself. And somehow, that quiet guidance had shaped him more than any direct order ever could. Samuel realized something then. His role had changed. He was no longer a commander. He was a guide, a mentor. The next time he saw David, he did something different. Instead of giving his opinion about his son's business decision, he simply asked, "What do you think is the best path forward?" David hesitated at first, as if expecting his father to push back. But when Samuel just nodded and let him speak, something shifted. David opened up, talked through his thoughts, and in the end asked, "Dad, what would you do?" And just like that, Samuel had been invited back into his son's world. With Rachel, he stopped correcting her parenting choices. Instead, he praised her for the patience she showed with her children. He didn't say, "You should do this differently." Instead, he shared a story from when she was little, about how he had made mistakes as a young father, how he had learned over time. Rachel didn't roll her eyes this time. She listened. And with Mark, the moment came unexpectedly. They were watching a baseball game together when Mark sighed and said, "Dad, I don't know if I'm handling things right with my job. It's a mess." Samuel didn't offer a solution. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, looked at his son, and said, "Tell me more." It was a small shift, but a powerful one. Samuel realized that his children didn't need him to lead them anymore. They needed him to walk beside them. And as he did, something remarkable happened. They began seeking him out again, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This is the lesson that many parents struggle to learn. You cannot hold on to the role of authority forever. If you try to control, you will be resisted. But if you offer wisdom when it's asked for, if you step into the role of mentor instead of enforcer, your children will see you not as a figure to defy, but as a source of quiet strength. Now I will turn this lesson over to you. Have you ever found yourself giving advice, only to feel like no one is listening? Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop pushing, your children start pulling you back in? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. Every life holds wisdom, and your stories may help others who are walking the same path. Let's share, respect, and learn from one another, because in the end, respect is not about leading the way, it's about walking it together. 4. Set emotional boundaries. The ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." These words ring especially true for parents who unknowingly place emotional expectations on their grown children. Many believe that love should be expressed in frequent phone calls, long visits, and heartfelt conversations. But what happens when those expectations aren't met? Disappointment, hurt, a quiet resentment that builds over time. I knew a woman named Eleanor, a mother, a widow, and a woman who had spent decades pouring her love into her children. She had always imagined that when they grew up they would stay as close as ever. She pictured Sunday dinners filled with laughter, holidays spent together, and long talks over coffee like they used to have when they were young, but life had other plans. Her eldest son Michael moved across the country for work. Her daughter Lisa was raising her own children, drowning in responsibilities. Even her youngest Daniel, who lived just an hour away, seemed too busy to visit often. At first, Eleanor brushed it off. "They'll call when they can, they love me." But as time passed, the calls became less frequent, the visits became rushed. Conversations felt obligatory rather than heartfelt. And slowly, Eleanor felt something dangerous creeping into her heart: bitterness. She never spoke of it, but it lingered in the silence after she hung up the phone, in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the holidays spent with more memories than company. One evening, she sat by her window, watching the sun set over the trees. She thought about her own mother, a strong woman who had never relied on anyone for happiness. Eleanor realized something then. She had spent too much time waiting. Waiting for calls, waiting for visits, waiting for her children to make her feel important. And at that moment, she made a quiet decision. She would stop expecting. She would start living. The next day, she signed up for a pottery class at the local community center. She started going on morning walks, greeting strangers, and making new friends. She joined a book club, where she met women who, like her, had once built their worlds around their families and were now rebuilding them around themselves. At first, nothing changed with her children. But then something strange happened. Michael, the son who rarely called, started checking in more often. "Mom, what have you been up to?" he asked one evening, surprised to hear her talk about her new hobbies. Lisa, overwhelmed with motherhood, started seeking her out, not out of guilt, but because she saw her mother as someone strong, someone she could learn from. Even Daniel, who had always been too busy, started making time for her. Not because she asked, but because he wanted to. Eleanor learned a powerful lesson that year. When you let go of expectations, you make room for genuine connection. When you stop waiting for love, you give it the space to return to you naturally. And that's the lesson I want to share with you. Have you ever found yourself feeling hurt by unmet expectations? Have you ever realized that the moment you let go, things started to change? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your wisdom, your experiences, because the greatest lessons in life are the ones we learn from each other. And remember, happiness is never something you wait for, it is something you create. 5. Make them earn your generosity. The great American industrialist Andrew Carnegie once said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." He understood something that many overlook. Wealth, whether it is money, time, or love, is not meant to be wasted on those who do not value it. True generosity is not about giving endlessly, but about knowing when and to whom to give. I knew a man named Walter, a kind-hearted father who had spent his life giving. When his children were young, he worked long hours to provide them with everything they needed. As they grew, he paid for their college tuition, helped them buy their first homes, and even bailed them out when they made mistakes. He never asked for anything in return, because, to him, that's what love was, giving without limits. But something changed as the years passed. His children stopped saying thank you. They no longer saw his generosity as a gift, but as something expected. When he helped, they barely acknowledged it. When he didn't, they acted offended. Walter never said no, even when it hurt him, even when they didn't deserve it. And over time, a painful truth settled in his heart. He had taught them to take him for granted. One day, Walter met an old friend, a man named Henry, who had taken a different path. Henry had also been generous, but with a difference: he made people earn it. "You see, Walter," Henry said, stirring his coffee, "when you give too much without asking for respect in return, you're not being generous, you're making yourself disposable." Those words struck Walter like a hammer to the chest. He had never thought of it that way before, but he couldn't deny it. That night, Walter made a quiet decision: he would change. The next time his son asked for money, Walter didn't say yes right away. Instead, he asked, "Why do you need it?" And when the excuse came, one he had heard too many times before, he said something he had never said before: "No." At first his son was angry. He lashed out, accusing Walter of being selfish, of not caring. But Walter didn't argue. He simply stood his ground. And for the first time he saw something new in his son's eyes: shock, then uncertainty, and finally respect. With his daughter, the pattern was different. She had always counted on Walter to help with her responsibilities, to watch the grandkids at a moment's notice, to adjust his schedule for hers. But one day, when she assumed he would cancel his own plans to accommodate her, he simply said, "I can't, I have things to do." Again, anger, again frustration, but something changed. She started appreciating his time more. She started asking instead of assuming. Walter learned something powerful that year: giving should be a privilege, not a habit. When generosity is given freely without appreciation, it loses its value. But when it is earned, it becomes meaningful again. And here's the truth: people respect what they must work for, they respect what is given with conditions, because conditions remind them that the giver is a person too, someone with needs, boundaries, and self-worth. Now I turn this to you. Have you ever found yourself giving too much, only to feel unappreciated? Have you ever realized that saying no can sometimes bring more respect than saying yes? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your experiences, because wisdom is meant to be exchanged, just like generosity. And when we learn to give wisely, we teach the world to value us in return. 6. Live a life that makes them proud to know you. The American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." There is deep truth in these words, especially for parents who have spent their lives sacrificing, adjusting, and shaping their identity around their children. But what happens when the children grow up and move on? Too often parents are left behind, unsure of their place, clinging to a role that no longer exists. The greatest way to regain respect is not to remind your children of your worth, but to become someone they admire, not for what you did for them, but for who you are. I knew a woman named Margaret. She was 74, a widow, and for as long as she could remember, her life had revolved around her children. She had cooked for them, cleaned for them, supported their dreams, and been there for every high and low. But now they are grown, busy, wrapped up in their own worlds. The calls became less frequent, and the visits shorter. At family gatherings, she felt like an afterthought, as if she had faded into the background of their lives. At first, Margaret did what many parents do: she waited. She hoped they would come around, that they would recognize how much she had given. She tried to stay involved, offering advice and asking about their lives, but something in their eyes told her what she didn't want to admit. They saw her as just mom, someone whose life was already written, someone who had nothing new to offer. One evening, she sat in her quiet living room, staring at the framed photos on the wall, pictures of birthdays, graduations, and weddings, all moments that had defined her life. But then she realized something painful. There were no pictures of her, no evidence of her own passions, dreams, or adventures. It was as if she had only existed in relation to them, and in that moment Margaret made a decision. She would stop waiting. She would start living. The next day she did something small but radical. She signed up for a painting class at the local community center. She had always loved art as a child, but had pushed it aside for responsibilities. The first day she felt silly, surrounded by strangers, unsure if her hands remembered how to hold a brush. But as she painted, something inside her woke up. She began taking morning walks, meeting neighbors she had never spoken to before. She went to the movies alone, something she had never done in her life. She traveled, not far, just to the next town over, but with each new step, she felt a piece of herself returning. At first her children barely noticed, but then something changed. Her daughter Amy called one day, surprised to hear Margaret rushing off to an art gallery instead of sitting by the phone. "Mom, what's gotten into you?" she asked, half amused, half curious. Her son Peter visited and found books stacked on the table and a canvas drying in the corner. "I didn't know you painted," he said, looking at her differently, as if seeing her for the first time in years. Margaret smiled. "There's a lot you don't know about me," she said simply, and that was the truth. Her children had been so used to her being just Mom that they had forgotten she was a woman with depth, talent, and a life of her own. But now they began to see her in a new light, not as someone waiting for their attention, but as someone living with purpose. Something unexpected happened. They started calling more, not out of guilt, but because they were genuinely interested in her life. They began asking her opinions, respecting her time, and seeing her as more than just a figure in the background. Margaret learned something powerful that year. Respect is not something you beg for. It is something you inspire. If you want your children to admire you, live a life that makes them proud to know you. And now I turn this to you. Have you ever felt like you were fading into the background of your children's lives? Have you ever made a decision to live for yourself, not just for them? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may inspire someone else to take that first step. And remember, you are not just a parent, you are a person, and your story is still being written. And here's what I want you to remember. Respect isn't something you wait for, it's something you create. When you stop chasing approval and start living with purpose, people take notice. When you set boundaries, hold your head high, and build a life that fulfills you, respect follows naturally. So ask yourself, are you waiting for them to see your worth? Or are you showing them through the way you live? Your life doesn't end when your children grow up. It evolves. And the moment you embrace that, something incredible happens. They stop seeing you as someone in the past and start admiring you in the present. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced this shift? The moment you realized respect had to be inspired, not demanded? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom, your journey, it matters. And if this message spoke to you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share, because the best way to honor a lesson is to pass it on. Thank you for watching, and remember, live in a way that makes them proud to know you.